Let me continue the case against composite sections by showing how the documentary hypothesis misses the coherence of the flood narrative as shown in its chiastic structure. Bernard Anderson portrays that chiastic structure as follows, seeing it as centered around God's remembrance of Noah, and there's a symmetrical structuring of it. Other scholars have seen the same thing. Gordon Wenham just looks at the timing elements of it, where you begin with 7 days of waiting for the flood, then at the end you have 7 days of waiting, and then another 7 days of waiting, and another 7 days of waiting, and 7:10 and 8:10, and then 40 days of flood before the flood, and 40 days of wait after the flood, and 150 days of the waters triumphing, and 150 days of the waters waning, and then in the center of all that, God remembers Noah. Again, highly symmetrically organized. He actually gives a much more detailed sequence of chiasm that starts with, goes from A to P and all the way back to A, where A is parallel with A prime, B is parallel with B prime, on through the entire list. And the point is this chiastic structuring shows that this is not just random cutting and pasting. Indeed, a writer with such a mastery over his material can no longer be simply called an editor. He's clearly an author. And there's no need to see contradictions in the flood story, since the chronology in the text is in fact consistent within itself. So some final remarks regarding the documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen grew up with an anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish bias of the Lutheranism of his day. And for that reason, Wellhausen preferred the simple religion of the patriarchs to the ritualized later religion of Judaism. And so for Wellhausen, primitive meant good, ritualistic meant evil. And so he preferred to see the original Mosaic religion as more primitive than the highly ritualized religion we find in the Pentateuch's so-called priestly sections. Now, this doesn't prove he was wrong in seeing the priestly sections as late, but does help explain why he came to be wrong. He wanted that material to be late. We should point out that the Katifi non silver amulets that we spoke of in terms of the text of the Old Testament also speaks against the documentary hypothesis. These silver amulets have a quotation from Numbers chapter 6, and that's a part of P, but it dates to the 7th century BC, which predates Wellhausen's date for P. At the very least, proponents of the documentary hypothesis have to say that at least that portion of P existed earlier before the exile, but perhaps the whole hypothesis that P is late is the fundamental problem. So how sound is Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis? I would argue that it's not very sound at all. So where does the documentary hypothesis stand from here now that things have proven unstable? Well, many liberal Bible scholars still accept this hypothesis despite its weakness, simply because they don't have anything better to replace it with. Some modify it in various ways. Some divide J into two sources, Eisfeld and Forer. Some reject the distinction of JE, but accept it as a single source, to which D and P have been added, and thus they have returned to the supplemental hypothesis. Some have de-emphasized written sources and opted for oral ones. We saw that with Gunkel and form criticism. Quite a few non-evangelical scholars, though, have been moving farther and farther away from Wellhausen, and you can see some of the names of people. I've quoted Wybray. Again, he's a critical scholar, liberal scholar, and yet wrote one of the more definitive repudiations of the documentary hypothesis in 1987. Now, conservative scholars have largely rejected the JEDP theory from the get-go, but even they have increasingly come to recognize that there are some post-Mosaic editings of the Pentateuch. So let's look at things from a more conservative point of view now and talk about the authorship of the Pentateuch. First of all, review the traditional view, but then I will give you reasons why I think it needs to be modified. The traditional view of the authorship of the Pentateuch is simply that Moses wrote it. Jewish and Christian tradition ascribes the book to Moses. For example, in the Apocrypha, Ecclesiasticus says, all this is in the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us. It associates Moses with those laws. Philo does the same thing, so does Josephus, so does Jewish tradition in the Mishnah. And there are certain older English Bibles that would identify the book of Genesis as the first book of Moses. Jesus connects Moses with Pentateuchal teaching. Matthew 8 and verse 4, show yourself to the priests and offer the gift of Moses commanded. Well, Jesus seems to ascribe to Moses the command to offer that gift in the Pentateuch. And Matthew 19 verse 8, Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, referring to Deuteronomy 24. And Mark 7:10, for Moses said, honor your father and mother, is quoting Exodus 20 and verse 12. And anyone who curses father and mother must be put to death, quoting Exodus 21 verse 17. And then John chapter 5, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. Now, if you are to say that Moses had nothing to do with writing the Pentateuch, you'd have to say that Jesus was wrong, it would seem. Now, there is evidence even within the Pentateuch of Moses' writings. Scripture attributes to Moses the writing of various laws from Exodus through Deuteronomy. And Moses is later on associated with a book in Joshua chapter 1, the book of the law, and in 2 Chronicles and Ezra speaks of the book of Moses. Even within the narratives, Moses is told to write things occasionally. So in Exodus 17, God tells Moses, write this, meaning an account of the battle, as a reminder in a book, and recite it in the hearing of Joshua. A single narrative seems to unite the entire Pentateuch, and that suggests unity of authorship in some sense. So if Moses is the book of Moses, then why couldn't it just be that Moses wrote the whole thing? Moses certainly was educated in the royal household of Pharaoh, as he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, would have received an Egyptian education, and would have been qualified to write. But there are problems with the traditional view, and we'll have to talk about that in the next video.